All right. Joining us now through Skype, I believe. He was a Bellator analyst and commentator. Now he is a UFC analyst and commentator, one of the very best that does it. The one and only Jimmy Smith, I believe, is here. There he is. Boy, in crisp HD at 9 a.m. How you doing, Jimmy?
I'm here, man. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing quite well. Jimmy, by the way, what is your responsibilities for International Fight Week?
I'm doing the TUF finale, man. That's what I'm doing Friday, so that's my gig next week, man.
What are you doing on Saturday night? Like, in other words, where are you going to be?
I got a vacation with my family that weekend, so I'm literally doing the TUF finale, and then I am gone. I'm out immediately, so I can't stick around for any of this stuff. So, yeah, my only gig is the Ultimate Fighter finale.
All right, we'll get to that in just a minute. Let's backtrack a little bit. I saw that you were at the Bellator show over the weekend. How was it being back?
It was fun, man. It was really to see all the guys. I mean, working at Bellator was great. Great people, great producers and everything. And they were finally doing a show in Southern California where I didn't have a gig. So I went down and said hi to everybody. And I actually got to see it from the production truck, which I never got a chance to do while I was working. So that was cool. And just meeting everybody and seeing everybody, that was really cool. Saw Limale after she won. She's fantastic. And it was great seeing all those guys again.
Yeah, and by the way, there are scenes of that from our own EKC Layden, or Leiden, I can never pronounce his last name correctly. He did a big video about it. It's on the site, so if you want to check that out, you may. All right, so Jimmy, let's talk about her. Ilima-Lei Macfarlane defeating Alejandra Lara, submission via armbar, 355 of round 3. You know what is so interesting about Ilima-Lei? She's only, 8, 9 fights into her career? She seems to be getting rapidly better, but more than that, she just has a ton of personality. I'm wondering, as someone who knows her a little bit, she has a bigger personality, I think, than a lot of folks realize, and you can begin to see it with each evolving fight.
She gets it. I mean, that's what we say in this business is, man, Ilima-Lei totally gets it. Not only does she has the look, she has the skills, but she's so engaging. You know, she's really into native rights. She's really into a lot of issues that really connect with the fans. She always, when she was in Temecula, she came out with a native dancer. She really does it up on the weigh-ins. She just really does a great job connecting with fans. And once you have that and you have the skills to finish and, you have the look that she has, she's got it all. She's fantastic.
All right, so let's talk about that finish itself. I thought for sure Lara was a goner, even on the first armbar attempt, and she just couldn't. Credit to Lara for being tough, but I'm wondering what you saw there. You have, to me, and someone like with Macfarlane, an incredible all-around grappling talent, correct?
Yeah. I mean, her submission game is fantastic. Needs a little work a little bit on her takedown game. She went for a couple throws that didn't work out early. You know, these big commitment kind of throws that didn't work out. But once she's on the ground and she gets her submission game going, she's absolutely fantastic. And she knew going into that fight, Lara's really flexible, really long arms and legs. You know, it's going to be hard to submit her. And I thought she was going to have to, go for broke and, actually really, really go for it to get the submission, which is exactly what she did. And when I was watching in the truck, she had the armbar, but her hips were just a little bit off to the side. And I turned to my producer to go, she's got to turn her hips to the left and get underneath. I can't help but, commentate the fight as I'm watching it with people. And I said, she's got to turn it. And as soon as she got her hips underneath to the left, that was it. It was done. It's fantastic.
Okay, here's sort of where I'm at with this one on her. You mentioned about the takedowns. Why is it that the takedowns on the women's side of the game are not quite as good as the men's? And let me be clear about this. I'm not trying to disparage the women's side. I'm merely saying, number one, you have more men who have matriculated from the wrestling side, so I think that's a big portion of it. But the best practices are really the same, and the men kind of train with the women. I'm wondering, am I misunderstanding the issue here? Why is it, do you think, there's a bit of a gap in terms of the technical acumen related to that particular part of the game?
Did you see, it was the NCAA finals in wrestling 2 or 3 years ago, I forget when, and they did a montage before the beginning of the actual matches and asked all the wrestlers, when did you start? And guys, it was guys like Logan Stieber, Isaiah Martinez, guys on world teams now, and they all went like 5. Like, I really got into it. I really started taking it seriously at 6. I really wanted to be a world champion at 7. The level, I mean, when I was in high school, women didn't wrestle. There were no women's wrestling teams. It just didn't happen. It's only really gotten big in the last couple of years. These guys that have takedowns that are really phenomenal have been doing it since they were little kids. And there's a tradition that goes back 100 years in this country where it's a really big deal. And women's wrestling has gotten big in the last few years, but the tradition isn't there. When you talk to a lot of the female wrestlers that have come up through that, they started in high school. I started in junior high, I got into high school, I won a sport, and like I became a state qualifier starting my sophomore year in high school. With men, that doesn't happen. You can't really be competitive on the national and international level. You didn't start when you were 5 or 6. So we're just used to seeing a much higher level. Most fans don't realize how long, when you see, a high level wrestler wrestling, how long they've been doing it. And so when we look at a women's fight, we're like, oh, their takedown's not as good. The guys that are good have been doing it 20, 30 years. And so women's wrestling hasn't caught up to that level yet. And so the comparison just isn't there. We're looking at a level, I think, with men that we don't appreciate how high it is. And so we see other people, oh, they're not quite as good. It's decades to get that good.
So that makes me wonder. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I also makes me appreciate St. Pierre more, and even Jose Aldo. I don't know how good Jose Aldo's takedowns were, but his version of MMA's referee position, where he's breaking the hands, leaning back, and then turning.
Yeah.
Like, he's doing that to guys, to your point, that have been wrestling for decades.
It's freakish. I mean, I remember when GSP fought Koscheck, and Koscheck goes, he can't take me down. I've been wrestling since I was 5. We all saw how that fight went. I mean, GSP's ability in terms of the MMA takedown is really, really incredible. And not just – and what you got to remember is, there are turns. There's all kind of stuff in wrestling that don't really apply to MMA, that MMA fighters just really pretty much have to worry about the takedown defense.
All right, so let's get into this weekend. Let's talk about that main event. Israel Adesanya, this is the fight that you're calling versus Brad Tavares. Israel Adesanya, I mean, you can't say enough good things about him, but he seems he handles all the questions well, but he clearly doesn't want the UFC, in his own words, he put it, to baby him. But then I just talked about Ed Ruth. Now, Ed Ruth's still a little bit earlier in his career. He's matriculating from another sport, but I'm not trying to use the word baby in a pejorative sense, but he's clearly taken the soft approach to the beginning of his career. What is the right approach for a fighter, and is Adesanya ready for a guy who is battle-tested in Brad Tavares?
One thing about this fight, Israel Adesanya versus Brad Tavares, every fan and pundit and expert that I talked to kind of did the eyebrow raise when they heard about this fight. They went, man, Brad Tavares is tough. Are you sure Israel Adesanya is ready for that in his 3rd UFC fight? And also, if you really study tape, which I've had to do for the last couple of weeks on Brad Tavares, he's tough to look good against. Even if, you're doing all right, you have a couple of good rounds, he's just so solid. His hands are so high. He's stocky, he's short, he's strong, doesn't take a lot of big risks. It's hard for somebody like Israel Adesanya, who can look so explosive and good, to look that good against Brad Tavares. It's a tough stylistic matchup for him. As far as how you groom a guy, there's a little bit less of that in the UFC. It's just, one of the things about Bellator is they've invested a lot in a lot of young talent like Ed Ruth, like Aaron Pico. The problem with that is those first 6 or 7 fights that you would normally have at some local promotion that might be a mismatch and nobody cares, happen under the bright lights in a big promotion. So they're brought up and raised up under bright lights. So a lot of their first few fights are, they have to be groomed a little bit, that they're investing in them early. They can't let them, stumble in their first 5 or 6 fights. We saw what happened with Eric Pico and Zach Freeman. We know what happens when you take on an experienced guy. So there's a little bit less of that in the UFC. I saw it a lot more in Bellator. Even Israel Adesanya, when he came in the UFC, had a backlog of fights. He had, beat Melvin Gillard, UFC veteran before that, absolutely destroyed him. So he had a little bit more background than Ed Ruth, but I see a lot more of that cultivating going on in Bellator.
And then it also reminds me of someone like Dylan Dennis. People were like, oh, he took a couple punches in his first fight. I'm like, have you guys seen people's first fights before? That's about as good as it gets. He looked exactly as I thought he would.
Yeah, well, that's the issue. Once again, we're seeing career developments that usually take place in obscurity. I always tell fighters the best time to lose is when nobody's watching and when nobody cares. In your first 5 or 6 fights, you're fighting at a local show, making a couple $100. You can go 4-2 in your first 6 fights because you're building up. It's not a big deal. At the end of your career, when you already have a name established and you're a Ken Shamrock or something like that, you can lose and you're already established. It doesn't really make any difference. Nobody cares. They don't get that luxury. When you start in, you're coming in as a hot prospect. In Bellator, and it's your first 5 or 6 fights, you're under the bright lights, under scrutiny immediately. So everything gets analyzed, everything. You don't get that grace period, you know?
Certainly don't, and he didn't either, although I thought he performed quite ably, given the circumstances. So this takes us to Saturday, when you are going to be not doing your job, out there gallivanting around the globe.
It's not my show, or I would have.
Let's talk about DC versus Stipe. We had Dan Hardy on the show last week. He thinks DC has an uphill climb. Look, I agree that DC has an uphill climb, but I'd like to stump for him. I went back and I looked at all of, and I'm trust me, I'm not saying that Josh Barnett is Stipe Miocic. I don't mean that as in a pejorative sense, but they're just not the same fighter. They're not the same size. Yeah. There's a lot of differences. But I went back and I looked at the predictions before Cormier versus Barnett, and there were some people picking Cormier, but a lot of people thought, you know what? He's a true heavyweight. He's going to lean on him. He'll find a way. It just sort of routinely didn't take into account the athletic gifts of somebody like Cormier. I realize he's 39, but do you share my sense that, yes, maybe he has an uphill climb against Stipe, but I just don't feel like people are taking into account what he can do, particularly on the speed side of things.
And that, I think, is a good thing for him. I think it's good to go in as the underdog. It's good to go in under the radar. It's good to go in as the guy where everybody's looking at the champ and everybody's looking at Stipe. So I think psychologically, that's a great place for DC to be, is kind of overlooked a little bit. I think he has a great chance in this fight. The one difference is Stipe has wrestled at a higher level than most of the heavyweight opponents that DC could have faced. Like he's not going to have that takedown necessarily in his back pocket whenever he needs it. It's not going to be a Volkan Ozdemir kind of situation where it's like, look, I'm going to go to this takedown. I know I'm going to get it if I need it. It's not always going to be there against Stipe, because Stipe does have an excellent takedown defense in his own right, did wrestle at a high level, obviously not at DC's level, but you know, he's had that wrestling background. So I think DC is going to have to be a little more judicious as to when he goes for that takedown. His timing has to be a little bit better. He has to work a little harder. He can't just dive in against someone who doesn't have that experience.
Do you think it's going to look a little Cain Velasquez-ish? And here's what I mean by that. You go back to Velasquez against the Dos Santos. He'd fire the underhook against the fence and just kind of push, begin to wear on him physically, lean on him. I realize there was a little bit closer in size between the two relative to DC and Stipe, but still, just the weight. You know, DC knows how to manipulate his weight, and then also kind of just bang on him on the other side, where you're pulling and pushing on the underhook, and then you're firing the punch on the other side. And 2 or 3 rounds of that, man, they're a different fighter afterwards. Do you think we might see some of that?
100%. I definitely think we will. I think DC is going to be either bullying against the fence, landing short punches, or on the outside going for that quick takedown. His level change is very, very fast. But, you know, I always say there's no bad build for combat sports. It's, do you use the build that you have? And DC's athletic, very, very quick for size. We haven't seen that slow down in his late 30s that we see in a lot of fighters. So, you know, he has all the physical tools. He has all the tactical tools. It's a matter of wearing Stipe down, like you said, against the fence, kind of making him smaller as the fight goes on, not taking huge risks and getting underneath going for a takedown. He cannot do that. He can't be in that sprawl and brawl position where he's underneath against Stipe, who hits like he stole something from him. Real heavyweight power. So
let's talk about Stipe very quickly. What is his essential rules of the road here? Is it sticking behind the jab, good footwork, staying off that fence? Because it seems to me if he can work behind that, I'm not sure there's a man alive who can beat him. The question is, of course, can he do it? But if that's working for him, I agree. I don't care who you are. You're going to have a real tough time with him.
Yeah, and finding the placement for that right hand. I mean, DC knocked out for the first time in his career against John Jones the last couple fights. So that's memory still might be in there. You want to get him overreacting to big punches. You want to hurt him and let him know, I'm the heavyweight puncher in here. You've never been in there with a striker like me who can really turn one over. And talk about the psychological edge. I mean, the problem with Stipe is he's in a position where he's chasing history. Right now, he's amongst the greatest heavyweights in MMA history. He's 1 or 2 in my opinion, and so he's chasing a great legacy. But we were just talking about the kind of the relative opinion of people. He kind of has to look great, I think, because a lot of people are always taking on a light heavyweight. DC's moving up. He might be in a position where he feels he needs to really overperform. If he can stay away from that and not let that mental pressure get to him, I think he has all the tools to win the fight.
And then last but certainly not least, Max Holloway taking on Brian Ortega. I have to be honest, the stakes of the main event are bigger, and it's a fantastic fight in every way you could ask for one. But if I can just speak to my own personal biases, and I don't ask anyone else to follow, but I just speak to what I am looking forward to the most, it's got to be that one. But here's the question. I am a big believer in the abilities of Max Holloway. I make that no secret. But I want to make sure I am not sleeping on Brian Ortega. So tell me, Jimmy Smith, what are the talents that Brian Ortega possesses that can, if he implements them correctly, give Max Holloway some real trouble on Saturday night?
Max Holloway has a tendency to step forward and brawl. He tends to fight Hawaiian, like let's meet in the middle and throw punches and see who goes down first. Against Jose Aldo, I think was a little bit past his prime at the time. He could win those kinds of battles. He could win those kinds of exchanges. Brian Ortega, when he hits, he can flatten anybody. He's a giant for this weight class. He really sits down on his big punches. Now, Frankie Edgar found out how hard he can hit. That's a big difference. I think he has more one-shot power than Jose Aldo did the 2 times Max Holloway fought him. Max Holloway is used to stepping forward and trading punches and being the guy who can walk out and kind of out-volume his opponent. I don't think he can do that against Brian Ortega. I think he needs to change his strategy a little bit. Punches in punches, then move out, angle a little bit, frustrate the fighter who hasn't been through the kind of rounds he has been through. That's his ace in the hole. I've been through a lot of 5-round fights. I'm the champion. I know what it's like to swim in deep water. You don't. So I think rather than the, step in the center of the octagon and bang kind of strategy, he needs to drag Ortega into a long, difficult fight that he's not that used to. I think he needs to change tactics in this fight.
Let me play devil's advocate, if I may.
That's my breakdown. Boom.
Yeah, and I'm done. He just walk off and hang up now. No, that was that was certainly my thought as well. I was like, if he can just sort of moderate the offense, and then the longer that goes, it works to his benefit. But then you look at Brian Ortega, the guy's got a gazillion 3rd-round submissions. I'm not saying he progresses in that sort of linear way that Holloway does over time, but it's not like he's not dangerous late either. How do you mitigate that if you're Max Holloway?
Man, you got to stay out of those tough positions. I mean, I think his ace in the hole is really his submission game. Brian Ortega has fantastic submissions, especially gets in dominant position. So you want to stay tactically very, very sharp and not end up in those bad situations, end of 3rd round, 4th round, where, it's the start of the 4th. He still has plenty of time to work and you're running out of gas. He has to be very, very careful when it comes to the positional game, the takedown game. Striking wise, Brian Ortega hits hard, but Max Holloway has more experience in long stand-up battles. And I think that's where his advantage is going to be. He cannot get mounted early 4th round, early 5th round, positions like that he needs to stay out of.
Any other fight on that card? I mean, Mike, this card on Saturday is like just bananas. So I'll ask you to narrow it down. Any other? Oh, you know what? No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask you about this. Felder taking on Perry.
Please.
Felder taking on Perry. Felder is certainly the more polished of the two, but I've talked to him a number of times. He's like, yeah, the game plan was not to do what I did. And I went ahead and won anyway, but it was definitely not that. A guy like Mike Perry, who's naturally bigger anyway, because it's going to be at 170, he could probably draw him into that. What are you making of this Felder versus Perry matchup at the last second?
Man, that's a tough one, because the one good news is you don't have to, in my opinion, Mike Perry is not a guy where it's like, that's late, I have to totally change my game plan. You know what kind of fight Mike Perry is going to bring to you. But Felder, to your point, can get drawn into those kind of brawls. That's exactly how he likes to fight. Where Paul Felder is best, on top, ground and pound, short elbows. Once he's on top of you, man, that guy is vicious. He's absolutely vicious. And that's going to be his key to victory is anytime there's a brawl, anytime we're throwing punches and the crowd's going crazy, that's when he's got to be looking for his takedown. Whether he's winning the brawl or not, he's got to win this fight on top. Mike Perry is a very, very hard hitter. He's big at 170 pounds. Paul Felder does not want to trade punches with this guy. He'll get drawn into that kind of brawl, but he has to use that as an opportunity to get his takedown going, get his ground and pound going, wear him down, cut him up, bloody him up, but do it on the ground where Paul Felder's on top. That's where he needs to be.
There was a rash of retirements last week. One of them was your colleague on that Fox Sports desk, which was Rashad Evans. I think I speak for many when I say I was glad to see it because he has done so much in the sport. There's nothing left to prove. But it was more than that. Felipe Aranches at age 30 retired. Josh Koscheck on my radio show retired. And then Johnny Hendricks on MMA Junkie retired. Any thoughts about the spate of retirements? It does seem coincidental, but nevertheless, I'm wondering what you made of them.
Well, I think the timing on all of them is good. I mean, there weren't many where I went, Oh my God, I can't believe it. I mean, these guys had accomplished what they needed to accomplish in the sport. They were on the downside of their skills. That's the time to get out. I mean, Koscheck announced it recently, but for a long time, it's well, he's had one fight in what 3 or 4 years. I mean, his body just isn't capable of keeping up with the sport anymore. And I think it's a good thing personally. I don't like seeing fighters hang out past their prime. I don't like seeing a fighter take more damage than he absolutely has to for his career. So I was happy about all of those retirements.
All right. So you're off to vacation on Saturday. Any other fight this week you're looking forward to? Any last one?
I'm looking forward to I'm looking forward to a ton of them because I have had to study like you would not believe.
Hold on. Let me ask you. Let me follow up if I may. Tell folks what your work method is. How do you study? Do you just get on Fight Pass and go, I'm just going to watch fights for an hour? What is it? What is your methodology? I'd actually be really curious to know.
All right, so what I do is the UFC sends out these bio sheets of the fighter. So in one corner, so I download all the bio sheets, and in one corner of my computer, all these bio sheets. So I click on the bio sheet, and the iPad on which I am speaking to you, I write down fights, the manner of the finish, and then I put whatever little thing strikes me most. Tends to win by this, tends to win in the first round, whatever's on the record. Then I literally sit there and I watch fights all friggin' day and make my notes. So on my iPad are all my notes for every single fight, both fighters. I have them together. And I basically jot down notes for all day. So, a standard card's 12 fights is 24 fighters. You spend an hour a day, that's a full day of study.
So you bring like a big...
But I do way more than that, way more than an hour.
So, but you bring like a big notebook to the fight. And so at each fight, you flip the page and there's all your notes and the finishes and everything?
Everything's electronic. I put everything on this iPad on which I am speaking to you. Everything's on. Like John Anik has like a notebook and all these cards and all this stuff. And I don't do paper anymore because it just becomes too much of a headache. So I keep everything. My iPad's always in front of me, and underneath that are all the UFC notes that they give me. And I just kind of reference those when I absolutely need them. But everything's electronic. Everything's right here, so I can kind of scroll around and see everything I need. Yeah.
Was this that ratty ass iPad you brought to my one radio show? Do you remember that?
Just the case is ratty, by the way. So yeah, the ratty ass iPad case that has been destroyed because I constantly destroy the stupid thing. Yeah, I got a new case, but the iPad's still the same, man.
All right. Well, you know what? Your analysis is about as good as it gets, Jimmy. I really, really, really appreciate you being on. I cannot wait to hear the call. I'll actually be there on Friday to cover the fights in person as well. You're truly, I cannot tell you how great it is to see your career thrive in the way that it has. And thank you, I know, for getting up and spending some time with me, man. I really, really appreciate it. Have fun with the call on Friday.
I will. Give me a call on Friday when you're in town. All right, brother?
I will. Okay. Thank you so much, Jimmy.